The question was raised earlier about how do we know, or can we know, anything about the emotions of those people whose memories were being erased? And I will turn it over to Eliza Gettel, who will tell us about the sack of the Athenian Acropolis in the 5th century BC.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Claire. Since I'll be largely talking about reactions to iconoclasm, I'll start with my own. When the events in Syria and Iraq started happening, I was in denial. So I'd like to acknowledge a few individuals who helped me to think about this subject and forced me to recognize my own position regarding these events. First, my grandfather, who emailed me a question asking about how common iconoclasm was in world history, and sort of started me thinking along these lines. And then my friends, Anna and Adam, who had a sort of mid-morning conversation about the destructions at Palmyra with me one day that led to the beginning of this paper. And since I'm particularly interested in how we can use interdisciplinary theoretical frameworks and methodologies to expose overlooked facets of the ancient world, I've been thinking about how our reactions to modern iconoclasm can prompt an evaluation of current scholarship about iconoclasm in the ancient Greek world. My plan today is to share some of these thoughts, and I hope that I can raise questions that'll contribute to our overall discussion and help lead to perhaps more defined answers. And I'd like to stress that I'm focusing on the Greek world, particularly Athens, for two reasons. One, that's what I study. And two, today we put a similarly high value on Athenian art as we do the art from Syria and Iraq, making it a particularly apt comparison. And the main takeaway here for me is that recognizing that emotion plays a large part in modern iconoclasm helps us to realize how uncomfortable we are with analogous iconoclasms in the Greek world, and how we have tried to rescue these events as positive events for the study of ancient Greek art. And having listened to the discussion after the first part, I might add how uncomfortable we are with the term iconoclasm in general. And we still have a tendency to rescue events today, I would say, as we try to grapple with our sadness and anger at what's happening in Syria and Iraq. We read media responses and we attend events like this one in order to try to make sense of them. And in doing so, we take comfort in objectivity. A quick Google search or a glimpse at recent tables of contents from various periodicals will show you how we do this. We focus on trying to determine what exactly has been destroyed, and we try to get at these new techniques that help us map the extent of the destructions. And these objective questions and responses are incredibly important. And I think there's also something to be said about taking a moment to focus on the emotions surrounding these events and ask what these present emotions can teach us about how we do history. Particularly, modern social media and modern politics have impressed on scholars that emotions are part of the historical process. Over the last 30 years, historians and anthropologists have developed methodologies for studying them. And so I ask, do we need to, and should we write about emotions in our ancient histories about iconoclasm? And I find it helpful to think about the modern context first. From the perspective of a student studying the classical world, used to reading scholarship on narratives of ancient iconoclasm, the most striking aspect of the modern context is how prominent emotions are in editorials about the rise of Daesh. In trying to understand why, I draw heavily on the ideas of Omer Harmansah, a professor of art history at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who contributed a piece to the most recent issue of ASOR's Near Eastern Archaeology. He points out that the Western world has largely consumed the videos that Daesh produces to publicize their actions at ancient sites and museums as documentary evidence of what has been destroyed. He also points out, however, that these videos are choreographed performances of destruction that have a more complex purpose and effect. And I quote, "ISIS's performative acts of destruction appropriate the transnational associations and value systems of global heritage to choreograph effective spectacles an attempt to allure their sympathizers and patrons, recruit further fanatics, humiliate local communities while annihilating their sense of heritage, and offend the humanitarian West. Essentially, as I read Hermannscha, he recognizes a tension between studying what I'll call the archive of destruction and acknowledging the emotions engendered in those performing the destruction as well as those experiencing it. And I discern a similar tension between the archive of destruction and the emotions iconoclastic actions engender in modern scholarship about the Greek world. Here I want to turn to the sack of the Athenian Acropolis in 480 BC and how it has been approached in classical scholarship. In order to understand this past, we need a bit of context. In 480 BC, the Persians, under Xerxes I, were retaliating against the Athenians who had burned Sardis, at the time a Persian capital, a decade earlier. If you've seen both 300 movies, you have a sense of how this story goes. The Persians invade Greece, defeat the Greeks in concurrent battles on land and sea, march to Athens, and Athens burns. What the movies don't show is the extent of the destruction carried out on the Athenian Acropolis. In 480 BC, although not yet the site of the Parthenon we know today, the Acropolis was a sacred site and a stronghold for the Athenians. Temples and statues dedicated to the gods, particularly Athena, graced the craggy hilltop. Archaeological excavations suggest that the Persians did indeed burn these buildings, pulled down architectural blocks, toppled marble reliefs, and attacked the statues. Art historians have pointed out that the destruction went beyond what could be called militarily useful. Several statues display evidence of having been hacked at with an axe or hammer, even perhaps beheaded in some cases. Modern classical scholars have largely overlooked the sacking of the Acropolis itself. The academic work that does exist tends to focus on what the destruction of the Acropolis signifies for Greek art. Much as people are using the videos of Daesh as documentary evidence for the destruction of cultural heritage, classicists use the destruction debris that the Athenians cleaned up, buried in pits, and thus preserved as evidence for the chronology of Greek art. Fragments from these pits belong to before the sack and epitomize archaic art. And here you have an example of a Kore statue, which is one of the main examples of archaic art, while new art after the sack belongs to the classical period. In this context, we mourn the sacking of the Athenian Acropolis, not with the Athenians, but for our own sake, because the sack destroyed the sort of classical art that we put up on a pedestal, often physically in our own museums, but also more broadly within our culture. And a quote from the most prominent scholar of the Parthenon, Geoffrey Hurwitz, epitomizes this phenomenon. I quote partially, "The history of the early Athenian art was essentially compressed into this one place, and it was this accumulated achievement that in just a few hours' time fell victim to the Persian massacre of images." What if we try to mourn with the Athenians and understand their experience of the event instead of focusing on what it means for art history? Generally, the experience of the sack plays a larger role in modern popular histories, both in film, think again the 300 movies, and print. These popular histories often address the Athenians' emotional response. For instance, David Studdard, in a 2013 history about the Parthenon for the British Museum, questions the possible emotions of the Athenians after their Acropolis' destruction. He lists humiliation, anger, and determination as possibilities. Emotions can have their place in academic work as well. Although we do not have direct access to the emotional context of the iconoclasm on the Athenian Acropolis, we do, as we do with the modern events in Syria, we can try to study the possible emotional reactions that these possible histories touch on.